Welcome everybody to the Modern CFO Show, where we sit down with some of the best and brightest minds in finance to share their experiences and lessons learned. Today with me is Joseph Voss from the CFO Centre, board member of L2 Aviation and fellow podcaster for Blackline Safety. Joseph, absolutely pleasure having you on the show today. Can you kindly just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your experience and what it is that you're doing currently?
Certainly, Zach. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate the introduction. It's interesting to do these episodes. I enjoy doing them, especially as a guest. Your comment about me also hosting a podcast we call the Faces of Future Ready. I like to be the interviewer, and as I like to say, I'm the invisible person asking questions. The guest is the one that people want to hear from. So putting me in this position is actually kind of interesting. So hopefully your guests will enjoy what we have to say. As a bit of background, I am currently a fractional CFO working through the CFO Center. My background includes accounting from an educational standpoint, accounting degree. I'm a certified public accountant, still currently licensed. My early career started in public accounting with what was now one of the big four. Back then we called them Big Eight. And I had a very diverse client base, everything from televisions and broadcast stations. There was a company out of Galveston that ran boats out to the oil rigs. I audited a Catholic diocese. So it was a very strange collection of clients. I like to call public accounting a boot camp for business because, after your first day, they pretty much expect you to be able to pick up the elements of whatever company it is you're auditing. So learning revenue drivers, cost drivers, what really drives the business value proposition becomes kind of endemic to what you do. So that's an early start. Went through mortgage finance and structured finance, spun off a subsidiary from Pulte Homes, spent several years at Dell doing corporate planning and corporate finance, and jumped into aviation, small business, total radical departure, and a couple of CFO situations with smaller companies, back to Dell for a few years, and then most recently was with a company based here in the Boston area, CFO of a SaaS company that did both SaaS and procurement, and that was about a $600 million company. So all of that leading up to where I am doing fractional CFO work, I think it creates an opportunity to pull from several different situations that I've been in the past and try and apply some good practices, hopefully best practices, for my clients.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to be picking your brains a little bit about your transition into the fractional side of things as well, which I think is very, very important, and how you can bring that experience together for your clients. And more importantly as well, do enjoy the other side of the seat, giving answers instead of asking the questions. Make sure you enjoy that too.
Right.
And I just wanted to kick things off because, in your experience as a CFO, in our previous conversations, you mentioned that, the number 2 position in a company should be the CFO. So what's the correlation between some of the best performing companies in the world and a great CFO? And also what happens if the CFO is positioned at the bottom of the C-suite? What does that tell you?
I've seen both of those situations. And the greatest example I like to point to was my longest termed employer, which was Dell. And, I like to say Michael had a number 2 person in the company, but the best number 2 that Michael could have was his CFO. And Dell is an incredibly well-run company, especially from a financial perspective. And at both of my iterations in the late 90s and in the 2015s and onward, it was crystal clear that Michael placed tremendous trust in the CFO, and the CFO guided so many aspects of the company, especially from a strategic and financial perspective, that it laid the groundwork from my perspective, which is a CFO should be the chief partner of the CEO. Now that doesn't demean the other aspects. I mean, you have to have a very strong sales and marketing because that's the fuel that feeds the engine. You have to have impeccable operations because that's how you turn sales orders into revenue and deliver happy customer results. You have to have legal, HR, all the various aspects of the company are just as critical, but the financial impact of everything the company does is what feeds the financial results of the company. And so the stakeholders, including the CEO, is highly reliant on that activity being a key part of how the company proceeds.
Exactly that, and there's obviously that correlation between the two, right? I mean, maybe if you was to do some kind of analysis that some of the greatest performing companies do have the CFO position higher up the ranks. We've probably seen that in tons of different companies as well. In your words, I guess, from our previous conversation, you did mention to me something really important, which was that nothing substitutes for good planning and nothing beats visibility. That stuck with me for a number of different reasons, but it'd be great for you to, if you can kindly elaborate on that message for us.
Sure, and not to take too many examples from one location, but when I ran planning at Dell in the late 90s, we were growing tremendously. And people would say, "What do you do at Dell?" And colloquially, I'd say, "We turn the high beams on high. We turn the headlights on high." Because when you're driving down a windy road of growth and navigating opportunities, and your velocity is increasing as either the growth increases or the environment's potentially changing, nothing beats the ability to see ahead and to look down that road and say, where do we think we're going to be? And let's plan accordingly. And the best planning, and I'll admit sometimes we were better at times than others on this, is to set triggers, to say, we need to be at this point along the way. In aviation, we call it a how goes it curve. Are we burning fuel at the rate we thought we were because we need to make it to our destination, and if not, we have to do something differently. And the same thing applies in business. If we can plan for certain results or certain financial aspects of what's happening, then that gives the stakeholders and the key decision makers the information they need to make better decisions. So I think you can't beat planning. And the flip side of planning is measuring those results and evaluating. So that's kind of the two pieces of that spectrum, is to say, what do we think we're going to do? And then how is it going and what are we doing?
Yeah.
I can't overstate the importance of that.
And I guess obviously both go kind of hand in hand, of course, especially when you're, in terms of planning, not only for your own CFO role, but also when you're communicating with the CEO, other members of the team, it kind of goes hand in hand with that communication side of things as well, of course.
Right.
Is it possible that you could tell us a story that the audience can learn from in your many years of working in the aviation industry? Because this is something I wanted to ask you about, because obviously not only are you an aviation fanatic, but you've had, you're a board member of L2. You've had a lot of previous roles in the aviation industry. So I'd love to know, a story that you can tell us that we can maybe learn from, if you have one.
Sure. And unfortunately, I have plenty, but excuse me, I'll keep it brief. I worked for an aviation startup, and we were creating a new business jet. And the founder he was charismatic, he was tremendously optimistic about our ability to change the industry. And what I sensed was lacking, in terms of, this is a story of how not to behave, is that we didn't do a lot of planning in this company, and we'd raise investor money and we'd proceed a certain amount down the pathway, and when you create a new product, you have to engineer it, you have to test fly it, you have to perfect it, then go through certification, and then create the product. And at the same time, you're trying to generate demand for the product. So you have a series of sales and marketing efforts, expenditures, etc. And as a company, we didn't do a good job of figuring out, how do we take the pile of cash we just got from our investors, and how far along does that take us? And then what happens after that? It seemed like we went from, hey, we have a lot of money, and then we get to a point in time where we'd say, no, we don't have a lot of money. We need to go raise more. And every time we tell the investors, this is it, this will get us to cash flow positive. It's like, well, no, it didn't. So to me, that's an example of, and every business does that. It's not necessarily aviation oriented. The difference in aviation is you're creating products that will potentially kill people. So you have to perform from the engineering side and the testing side at a much higher level of proficiency than, say, if you're building computers, because generally technology, like a computer, doesn't kill you, but an aviation product will create a smoking hole faster than anything. So we have to. So that's an example. On the flip side, I worked in the FBO service business. FBO stands for fixed base operation. That's where private aircraft go to get gas at airports.
Right.
People may have seen a Signature Flight Support or an Atlantic Aviation. That's what they do. So in the middle 2000s, I worked with a company doing a roll-up where we were buying FBOs from other companies. And to me, that was almost the flip side of the equation. We engaged with a PE company to raise some funds to go out and do this. Working with the PE company, we planned extensively on what the acquisitions looked like, both before we acquired them to get a multiple for the sellers with which they were comfortable, what we were going to do with the locations after we acquired them to create multiples that made sense for the PE company and for us, and then to create operating plans once we've done the acquisitions. So that's an example of finance working hand in hand with most of the stakeholders so that we created successful results. And the end of that was the company who I was working with sold out to one of the bigger FBO chains, creating a payday for everybody. So that's an example where good financial planning, good financial practices can really pay off for everybody involved.
Yeah, and in that first example you gave of the slight oversight on the planning, what was the size of that startup? Are we talking very, very early stage, or is this 10, 20 employees at this time?
No, the company started from zero at scratch. I think the first fundraise was in the $50 to $60 million range, right. And by the end of the day, we raised a little over $1.2 billion. Wow! So it was a bit of a crash, so to speak.
Well, I know the only reason why I ask is, coming from a startup founder background, I know there's tons of companies out there that raise money with one employee. It could be with 10 employees, and when you're dealing with startups, I know that everyone kind of gets involved in all different kind of aspects. So, would you say that the oversight is, especially in early stage startups, is that the sheer responsibility of a CFO, or should the CEO and other members of the team be accountable for that as well when we're dealing with early stage startups?
I think it's personally the responsibility of all the leadership team, regardless of the company stage.
Right.
So so I'm working with a company now that is about 10 years into their growth. They're progressing well on their growth plan. There is an executive leadership team. There's also a very both interested and involved board of directors representing the ownership team. And everybody in this situation seems to be taking seriously the responsibility for managing the company. Right. I look at it this way, regardless of where a company is, especially CFOs, but in a broader sense, the executive team has a fiduciary responsibility to take care of what was given to them because it's not theirs. I'm one of those people that I do not like to borrow things from people, because if I do, I'm going to do everything I can to take better care of it than if it were mine. Because if it's mine and something happens, oops, that's my bad. But if I've taken something from somebody and it doesn't belong to me, I have a much higher care of duty or duty of care to take care of that and make sure that we do well with what was handed to us to manage.
Yeah, exactly.
That's my personal opinion, is that there's nothing more sacred than the fact that you've taken something that belongs to someone else, and if they're not kept informed of what's happening, if you're not doing the planning to make sure that what they thought was going to happen is what's happening, then communicate and keep them informed of what's the progress.
Yeah, and
I think that's sacrosanct.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, I see it on, LinkedIn all the time with different companies that have raised, it could be 1 million, it could be 10 million. And I think people overlook the fact that that is 10 million that can't be chucked down the drain. It has to really have great responsibility to grow that money. And I wanted to ask you on this because I know you've had extensive experience in raising capital. As a CFO, a key role of the CFO role is managing investor money. And it could be, like I said, it could be 1 million, it could be 100 million. And I guess there's some kind of art form into handling that money well and, being able to receive more when you need it, which is obviously the second part of it. So in your experience, can you share some skills on how you can build and hold those relationships with stakeholders and investors?
Sure. So I think the number one fundamental is transparency. And so if you look at the spectrum of involvement with a stakeholder, obviously there's the enticement to invest. Please invest because we're going to do these things. And when you do that, you set expectations. Mm-hmm. You set expectations that we're going to take your money and we're going to turn our business from this level to that level, which will ultimately make your investment worth more, which is why you would do it in the first place. Otherwise, what's the point? So setting expectations and agreeing on those expectations is like number one along the pathway. And then continue to monitor the business, to plan ahead, and to communicate the results back to the investor base. And things aren't always going to go the way you want. They actually rarely do. There's an old saying about battle plans. Once the first bullet is fired, whoop, there goes the battle plan. We just now react and proceed. And so businesses, in a lot of ways, not unlike that, meaning that we'll set a plan for the year and oops, we've lost a customer or we gained one, or we have something like tariffs in the U.S., which we hadn't planned on. Now we have to adjust for that. And so frequent updates with your investor base, frequent communication with those that have handed you their money, and keeping transparent not only financial results, but the actions of the company to adapt and to overcome, quite honestly. That is the best way to maintain that investor confidence. And once you have the confidence and once they feel like they have a role in helping everyone to succeed, I can't think of a better way to keep them engaged and quite honestly have them still be on your team. I've been in situations when the investors were no longer like friends of the company, but we still had their money. That's not very comfortable. I'll tell you that with a lot of experience.
Exactly, yeah. I think it's always those ones can always be a bit of a difficult conversation, but I think you hit the nail on the head there. I guess the key point is just maybe it's something that a lot of individuals or businesses maybe don't do as much anymore, but it's just having a bit of like old school values, right? And just being open and honest and having that communication, because like you say, there might be times where you borrow X amount and in 2 years you may need to borrow again, but you need to have a good track record of reporting and having those maybe difficult conversations, because you don't know when you're going to need to go back and maybe ask for more or whatever it may be, of course.
That's right. And so that's one of the key points of keeping your investor base engaged, informed, updated, and having them feel like they're a partner, because let's just suppose that company ABC said we're going to raise a certain amount of money and we believe confidently this is the last we'll need before we hit cash flow positive, and there's either a liquidity event for the investors, there's an IPO, something, but the company's on, this will take us on an upward path. And if everyone agrees in the fundamental drivers of why that business is valuable, and everyone agrees on what we think is going to happen, and then we keep them informed as we hit the potholes in the road or whatever you want to call it, and something happens that doesn't destroy the overall value but affects that cash flow, mm-hmm. you have no better of a partner willing to potentially jump in and engage more if they all understand what's happening, why we got into this situation where we are. We still believe in the outcome ultimately of the company, and we're going to partner with you and make sure that we all succeed, and most importantly, I get my money back at a higher value. I'm willing to risk a little bit more. I've seen that, and again, there's the best way to do that is to keep them engaged.
Yeah, and of course, I think, well, you've got more experience than I, right? But especially the last few years, we're seeing the world's a bit more of a difficult place it was than the early 2000s. So we're talking, changing interest rates a lot more frequently. We're talking currency movements, tariffs out the blue. And these are things that can have detrimental impacts on a lot of businesses, So I can only imagine if you're sitting down with investors and you've made a 12-month plan, the amount of companies that may wait until the very end, they've hit a pothole 3 months in, they're not on track, but they're going to wait till the very end, and then they have that difficult conversation, and the investors are blindsided because, they were under the impression that we were on track. But what you're saying is making sure that when those potholes occur, that you report back to make sure that everyone's on the same page, right?
I once worked with the CFO of a parent company. We were a subsidiary. I was a CFO, and this gentleman was the CFO of the parent company. I respect him immensely, and early on in my involvement, his comment to me, kind of almost a dry humor, almost a warning, was bad news does not age well. Bad news is always best served hot because of several reasons. One, people need to be kept informed. Number two, is there something we can do about it? And number three, let's understand why it happened so that we don't have risk of those types of events in the future.
Yeah.
So your point about waiting until you get to the end and going, hey, Mr. Investor, I'm sorry we've run through all your money, but we're going to need more, and we didn't give you a chance to understand why we got into this situation, that is a recipe for disaster. You're not going to have someone step up and say, hey, I'm going to give you more money. They're going to say, go get it from someone else.
Yeah.
Or we're going to have a tough conversation.
Exactly. And I can only imagine how many businesses are maybe run that way, hopefully not, but I think it's a good lesson for all of us, just as a gentle reminder. And that bad news may not necessarily be in the investor space, right? There could be bad news in all kinds of parts of the business. It could be the CFO reporting to the CEO or a team member reporting to a manager. I think that's a good all-round, good bit of advice there for everyone.
I would also, just if you don't mind me interjecting, one of the benefits, I believe, of having an active investor base and part of the role of the CFO is to keep that communication pathway open, is that the best companies and the best opportunities for success that I've seen is when both the CEO and the CFO admit they don't know everything. And too many times I've worked in situations where the smartest guy in the room was the CEO, or at least in his mind, he was the smartest guy in the room. And that's a very limiting situation. It's incredibly limiting to say, I know enough and I'm going to reject other input because I don't need it. Mm-hmm. And my thought process, and sometimes I've actually had to say this, is, well, then you've set the limit of where we're going.
Yeah.
You have absolutely limited our capability to move forward beyond what you can think. And to me, that is such a shame, because I'm first to admit, probably at a fault, to say, wow, I am far from knowing everything. I hope I know enough. So all input from other sources is helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, I think all of us have that, right? It can be a little bit of maybe a bitter pill to swallow. If you've been doing something for X amount of time and someone comes up with a genius way of doing things that you maybe not have thought about, but at the end of the day, you have to take those on board to think about the bigger picture and growing the company, which is the important thing. And I also wanted to ask, just moving on to the fractional side of things, you've kind of been there from the start, right, of just doing your traditional CFO work, being in a finance function, to now being more into the fractional space. And brilliant, because your smaller companies now have access to a CFO like yourself that they wouldn't have, let's be honest, they wouldn't have been able to afford before. So I'd love to get your take on what's the benefits of fractional work, not only the benefits for the company, but also how it's helped you as a CFO as well. Sure.
So there's a couple of things. So in doing fractional work, it almost feels like a return to my early days at Ernst, where you have a variety of clients and a variety of businesses that you help, and you get to see a much more diverse set of company situations, everything from how large they are to what type of business they're in, what type of industries they serve, and what are the fundamentals that affect that company. And even more importantly, you get a much more diverse set of financial talent with which you're dealing, Some companies that are larger have a bit more of a finance team. Some have limited, maybe one or two folks. And so the ability to have an impact on that across different situations is part of what makes this interesting. Again, it's not, there's not everything about being a fractional CFO is the best, because you have to go out and find clients. So you suffer what I call the consultant's curse, right? Which is, I'm not going to get paid while I'm looking for work. And when I'm getting paid, it's hard to look for more work, because you're busy performing on behalf of your clients, which doesn't give you a lot of time for business development. And when you have a lot of time for business development, that means nobody's paying you. So there are challenges. But the benefit of doing that is to see these different situations. But I think actually the biggest benefit to me is to feel like you're making a positive impact on a company from what you stated. They either don't have the situation where they can hire a strong CFO, or they can't afford it full time. But for the time that you spend with them, hopefully, and I have a client success story where my involvement positioned them to do things they weren't capable of doing before.
Right.
And that is, to me, the ultimate benefit of fractional CFO work, is that you are able to help people out who are in a situation where hiring a CFO at whatever level of pay or whatever level of experience and capability is out of their reach. But you put it into their reach by saying, I'm going to spend, a handful of days a month, equivalency, to help you do whatever it is you need to do. And this, my first major client, since doing CFO work through CFO Center, was a very small SaaS company, and they had lost they had one person who was helping them with planning and some numbers, and they lost that, regardless of how capable that activity was. And so their first request from me was, help us plan for the next 18 months to 2 years so that we can really be sure to get a hold of our limited cash resources and where it's going to go and how do we position the company. And then that turned into looking at their financial reporting to make sure they were on a GAAP basis. So we turned that around, and then improving the reporting across the company and the leadership team. And then it moved into a situation where the CEO really needed to look at liquidity opportunities, and looking for additional capital actually turned into an exit for him and other folks within the company.
Right.
So you go from, hey, we're pretty good at what we do, but we don't have much financial talent, and nearly a year later, hey, here's the payoff, and we close the deal, and it's payday for him and some other folks. That's a great success story. And what I've told people is, I don't think they would have gotten there without someone doing what I did. I would never in a million years say it was me. I would say you needed someone to do what I did or equivalent, and that's the value of a fractional CFO. And actually got a nice recommendation from the CEO. I actually had him write something up. I said, I want to be able to take this and use this for future marketing, because they're gone. Once they got acquired, it's almost like you can, the better you can do your job, sometimes the best you can do is to work yourself out of that situation.
Yeah.
And that's another aspect of fractional CFO work, is you do really well. There's a likelihood the customer might, or the client might get to a situation where they have an exit and now they're gone. Okay, well, kind of dust your hands off and say, well, that was good. Let's go do another one.
Exactly. I mean, it's amazing, because not only do the clients get such great benefit that they wouldn't have been able to get before, but obviously you can help them along the way in that growth journey. So, they would have needed help to get acquired. They would have had to do a lot of reporting that they wouldn't have had access to before. And like you said, all they needed was that CFO that can now come in and help them with that. And from your perspective, it's great, because you get, I can only imagine, great satisfaction of being able to be part of that journey and be part of that success, and then not only end it, but then go and repeat that journey for a number of different customers. Must be a great feeling as well.
Right. So, there's a lot of motivating factors as to why people get up and go to work every day, and money is definitely not at the top of the list for a lot of folks. I mean, obviously we work because we want to get paid. We have bills to pay. But the satisfaction of knowing that someone is better off having had your involvement, and when, from a macro perspective, I like to say I took this company and helped them go from where they were to exit. That's the macro view. The micro view is all throughout that process, working with the CEO and other leaders, and helping them see things a little bit differently. And every now and then they help me see things a little bit differently. I mean, that's part of the give and take, is, we're all learning. And if I haven't learned through that process, then I'm failing to take advantage of the experience and the interaction.
Yeah.
So to me, that's one of the benefits of being involved in a situation like that. And then the challenge is go find the next one.
Yeah, exactly. And you keep on repeating that process. And I'm thinking out loud, actually, because at some point later in my life, I'd love to have an opportunity to do that kind of fractional work where I can go and, help a number of different companies. Like I've been in the same industry since I was 17. It's been, nearly 11 years now. And I can only imagine, maybe a lot of CFOs have this as well, but for me, I only know what I know in this one industry. And I think, if you're in the aviation industry, a lot of these companies will probably operate differently, but, a lot of the reporting will be similar. There'll be a lot of similarities between them. So for you, having the opportunity to, be in a business like Dell and aviation, and then all of a sudden work for a very large, huge fishing company in the States, for example, you then have an opportunity to go and see the way that they bring their sales in, the kind of CRMs and software that they're using, that you wouldn't have even had an idea about how businesses run, and you can probably take and learn from that and add that to your skill set. Has there been any times where you've kind of learned something because of a different industry, if that makes sense?
Oh, all the time. I used to say that every time I did something was a first for me. So, for example, I worked in public accounting, and then went into the mortgage business. I'd never been in the mortgage business, so I worked in a couple of different areas. Finally, working in what we call structured finance, doing we were pooling our non-conforming mortgages into large pools and selling them off to Wall Street in what are called structured securities. Had never done that before. Went to work for Pulte Homes. They had a subsidiary in my area that they were trying to spin off, and I'd never spun off a company before, so I worked with the CFO of the subsidiary, and we created all the documents and the planning and all the necessary aspects, brought in some investors, and bam, that got sold. And then go into technology with Dell. Never been a part of a computer company. So, repeat that cycle over and over in my career. And, I sometimes admire the continuity of someone having done something with the same company for many years, because you gain an expertise, quite honestly, that some of us don't when we move between industries and companies and situations. What I like to think is the benefit of what I've been able to do is to latch on to the practices, my experience, and what I've seen across a variety of companies to say, well, here's what seemed to have worked well. Here's what I saw in this place. Let's not do that. And to accumulate that so that when you sit down with a new client or with someone who's in a different situation, it's not difficult to provide value. I like to think that my fundamental core is understanding finance, the intricacies of both strategic finance and tactical finance, and key business drivers and other aspects that can help a company. I personally believe context of what that company does should be the easiest thing for me to learn. If I know everything else as part of what I've been doing for however many years, and I walk into a company in an industry I've never seen before, it shouldn't be that tough for me to ramp up and add some value, because the questions that we have to ask and the things we learn about what drives their business, there are other people in those companies where that company relies on their deep domain experience. I think a CFO can be successful even if you haven't gone to this company that does ABC widgets or whatever, because ultimately every company is the same. Every company is the same. When I was going through my initial flight training, my instructor said the same thing. He pointed at an airliner. I'm sitting in a little trainer aircraft. airline I goes driving by, and he said, "You could fly that." I'm like, "They're nothing the same." And he goes, "Trust me, they all act the same way." And I've learned that's basically true. So in business, I think it's the same way. You have to have people with deep domain experience, but a good CFO with enough domain experience, zero may be tough, but enough even tangential or ancillary experience, I think can provide a lot of benefit to a company.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's, like you say, you kind of hit the nail on the head. A lot of businesses will operate the same way. It's kind of universal that the CFO role is to go in and do the same things. It's just putting the right expertise in the right place and making sure that the train runs efficiently.
Right.
I wanted to just end the show on a very quick fire round. Just got
Sure.
a couple of questions for you. What's your favourite podcast at the moment? And what I know you can't be biased because you are the host of a podcast, but other than that one, is there any great podcasts that you're listening to at the moment?
I do like that one from two perspectives. One is that it is very focused on the office of the CFO and how to make improvements, and I feel like I can say that without bias, because I honestly believe my role as the host is like, I'm just the invisible guy. Let's bring the guests in because that's who they want to hear from. Nobody wants to hear me speak. And the second perspective is that this podcast has run a range of guests, everything from guests on leadership to guests on technology development. We had the founder of Shazam, if you're familiar with that app.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The music recognition app. That was a fascinating one. And others who and actually the most recent one dealt with how to make incremental change in the finance function versus waiting for huge stair-step change. And I think a lot of people get they get delayed on making substantive change because they think it has to be a huge project. That was a fascinating episode. The other one is some folks I know run one called Wicked Connections.
Okay.
And it is a podcast based on the value of networking. And I am a huge fan of taking as much time out of your day or your week or however you want to carve it up and make sure you're part of professional associations, make sure you actively network and connect with people, because you really never know where the value of that connection is going to take you. And it's not meant just to be totally selfish, because I've been in those situations where I meet someone and through the power of networking, I can connect that person and they go off and have a situation that works to their benefit, et cetera. So I'm a huge fan of getting out to events, creating a network of folks. Sometimes they become friends, sometimes it's just pure business opportunities, but I think it's all good. So that Wicked Connection is one that I like.
Yeah, and that's the power of the networking thing, right? Is that not only can you help other people, like if you've got a huge network, you might have someone that's looking for a client, you might be able to help, but it's a kind of if you're a big believer in karma, sometimes that comes back the other way, and you might get a referral for a connection or something like that. So it kind of goes both ways, that you can help and receive at the same time.
Yeah, actually, my the 3 or 4 clients I've had since doing this a year ago all came from networking opportunities.
Really?
Every single one of them. And at the CFO Center, we like to think that we do. We have folks who do business development on behalf of the CFO consultants. I've brought mine to the table, just because of the folks that and again, I don't look at it as being me focused. It's like, hey, I met this guy, and he was like, hey, I know someone you should call, or someone else I see at another one of these events. And a week or two later, he rang me up and said, you should talk to this person because they need some help. And all of those are fantastic situations.
Yeah, and it's
So
always a much easier and a much better foot in the door once there's already a connection there as well, of course, which always helps.
It does.
What's working and living in aviation taught you about life and business?
Several things. So I'll give you 2 anecdotes, because I could talk for hours. I've worked for aircraft manufacturers, and I've worked in the aircraft service business. And it's much better So, for example, in the aircraft service business, I worked in the FBO business, I mentioned, where we're basically selling gas and storing airplanes. And it's much easier to sell gas to someone because they have to have it because they bought an airplane,
Right.
than trying to sell someone an airplane they don't need. Nobody, and I mean this, nobody needs a private aircraft. They want it. They feel like it will help improve their lives, but nobody needs it. So you're selling a large ticket item to somebody that they don't necessarily need. So those people who can do well selling airplanes, hats off to them, because it's difficult. But when you work in the aviation service business, that's a necessary item. So scaling that back to other businesses, it seems that the more successful you can be is when you're dealing with something that people need to consume for their existing whatever is happening in their life versus trying to introduce them to something new. You know, we talk about this in startup situations where it's much easier to sell a painkiller than it is to sell a vitamin.
Right.
And that analogy of mine in aviation kind of, are airplanes vitamins? Probably. Once you bought an airplane, fuel's a painkiller. You got to buy it. You
Right.
got to have it. The other anecdote I will tell you is that passion and business fundamentals do not always overlap. I learned that in aviation. That happens in every industry. Someone says, I'm passionate about this widget or this service I'm going to provide. And if you don't step back and take a look at that and say, yeah, but is it really a sound business value proposition? And who's going to buy it? And how is that going to succeed? And I've been a part of several aviation entities where, again, the passion runs far ahead of the business acumen. And I've also been a part of it where people said, hey, we'll do this, but only if it makes sense. So I think that's been a huge learning curve, both in aviation and in other industries as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because you like to see people with passion do well, but I'm just thinking out loud. An example of maybe someone who's got a real passion for coffee but opens a coffee shop in a neighbourhood where there's only 10 people. For example, it's kind of one of those similar kind of things I can imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. We actually, my wife and I have good friends with someone who did that. They opened a coffee shop, but it was in a place that had high traffic, and they offered something different and unique.
Right.
And so you again, it's the same thing. Hey, I'm passionate about coffee. It's like, that's great. We all love coffee. What makes you special? Mm-hmm. What's going to drive people to go buy yours instead of somebody else's? And when they do buy it, is it profitable to you?
Yeah.
That's kind of the simple, the two measures someone should think about when starting a business is why you, and is it going to make sense once you're taking somebody's money?
Perfect advice. And lastly, advice for other CFOs in 2025.
So probably the best advice I could give for CFOs, almost of every level, is that be transparent with your leadership, be transparent with your employees, and be transparent with your stakeholders, which typically your investors. Make sure that your processes are as good as they can be everywhere. I mentioned earlier this dynamic of stair-step transformation versus continual transformation. I think this has been around since the 80s or longer. They called it Kaizen in Japan, but it's this continuous look to how do we improve the finance function. And then maybe most importantly, excuse me, for companies and from a strategic standpoint, is looking at prioritizing liquidity. A CFO's, in my mind, a CFO's number one job, there's lots of things the CFO has to take care of, but the number one most important thing is company liquidity. Because if you run out or if something happens, then game's over everywhere. So maintaining that liquidity, the forward view of what that liquidity looks like, and then helping the company apply that liquidity to improve your profitability, to help a company grow. But that big L on liquidity has got to be number one.
Perfect. I can't thank you enough for today's show. I've learned a lot. I know the audience is going to definitely have learned a lot. If people want to reach out to you, maybe they've caught a grasp of something that you've said, they want to ask a follow-up question, maybe they want to have you as a CFO, what's the best way to reach out to you, Joseph?
Probably the best is on LinkedIn. Joseph Voss. There are not a lot of us. There are a few, but you can reach me on LinkedIn. And Zach, to your point, I'd be happy to converse with anyone who has a question, even a casual comment. Like I said, if something I can do helps out somebody else, then that's value in my day.
Exactly that. Joseph, thank you so much for your time. Make sure you have a beautiful week ahead, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon. Thank you so much.